Hi everyone, thanks for being with me today. This is a very special presentation. I returned to Cuba after 47 years, and this presentation is about what I learned on gender and on women after the revolution, after 1959. So I hope you enjoy it. And of course, once I'm done, I would really encourage you to do questions, and I'll try to answer them. On the last day of our stay in Cuba, we visited the Buena Vista Club, which is very famous for the music. So I use one of their songs called 20 años, 20 years, to be the background noise, not noise, song for the short video. So I hope you enjoy it.
¿Qué te importa que te ame si tú no me quieres ya? El amor que ya ha pasado no se debe recordar. Fui la ilusión de tu vida, un día lejano ya. Hoy represento el pasado, no me puedo conformar. Hoy represento el pasado, no me puedo conformar. Si las cosas que uno quiere se pudieran alcanzar, tú me quisieras lo mismo que 20 años atrás. Con qué tristeza miramos un amor que se nos va. Es un pedazo del alma que se arranca sin piedad. Es un pedazo del alma que se arranca sin piedad.
The map of Cuba is perhaps like a long lizard, if you were to think about a shape, but it's almost the same size as Pennsylvania. For us, it's easier to remember it that way. The population is about 11 million, and this is from the census of 2002. The census is going on right now in Cuba in 2012. They're in the midst of it. So the numbers that you're going to see are from 2002 and some from 2007, and I will say so in my presentation so that you're aware. Cuba is the largest of the Greater Antilles islands. This is the flag of Cuba, and if you're Puerto Rican, you'll say, oh, that sounds like familiar, because it's identical except for the colors that are different. But it's the same kind of distribution of shape. I visited Cuba last month in October with the League of Women Voters of Florida in a delegation, people-to-people, titled Sisters Across the Straits. This people-to-people delegation had an incredible leader. Her name is Annie Betancourt, and she was phenomenal. She structured it really well for us to be able to talk and to see many of the women co-ops and organizations in the island of Cuba. We were about 26 women and men. We had one guide, a Cuban young man of 30 years old, and we had a Cuban bus driver. And together we spent 7 days in Cuba. One of the things that we strive to do is to find a partner in Cuba that will be similar to the League of Women Voters in the United States. So we found that the Federation of Cuban Women is to a certain point mirrors what the League of Women Voters does in this country. And therefore, they were perhaps our biggest partner in this trip. We visited with them 2 co-ops, one farming and one sewing, that is run by them and is run entirely by women. So that was pretty interesting. Cuba was a colony of Spain until the late 19th century. In the 20th century, we went through different governments as a republic, and most of those governments were corrupted. In 1959, Cuba had a social revolution, and that social revolution was led by Fidel Castro. It's a name that you probably have heard many times. The revolution's mission was to even the power and wealth experienced by the few in Cuba. It promised, among other things, prosperity, literacy, land reform, and wealth. Among other things, it also promised gender equality, which is perhaps my main focus today, since I'm Women's Studies Director. Castro's Cuba shared diplomatic and government relations with almost the entire world, except with the United States, which is roughly 90 miles from Cuba. It was in 1961 when Cuba and the United States faced the missiles crisis. Ever since then, the United States government imposed an embargo to Cuba, not allowing commerce, travel, trade, and government dealings between the two nations. In part because of this embargo and for other interests, the government of Cuba formed an alliance with the Soviet Union from the 1960s to the 1990s. Today, families with relatives living in Cuba can visit Cuba from the United States under special circumstances. All other travelers need to have a license or belong to the following categories. If you are a professional, such as a doctor, if you're an artist, if you're an athlete, or if you're an academic, you can go back and forth from the United States to the island. But now, starting January 2013, Cubans can travel outside of the country for a longer period of time, up to 2 years. It used to be only 21 days, without their travel visa. So the future will tell how many Cubans favor traveling outside of Cuba and how many will return back. One of those special licenses to Cuba was given to the League of Women Voters between 2010 and 2012 for a people-to-people delegation. It was a very structured schedule. We met and greet different people in Cuba. This is not an official government visit, so we were not there to talk about politics, and we were not there to pass judgment on better or worse than us, just merely to visit and get to know them and get to know the culture. Sisters Across the Strait schedule included 2 visits to the Federation of Women Projects. And I think that was really different for us because everybody talks about Havana, but we landed in Cienfuegos, which is one of the towns that is near Havana. And we landed in an area that is pretty rural. So we were able to see farming and to see the land and to see the beauty of the land and to meet people that most of them were either drivers or farmers. And many of them were women. So that was very different, and I was very surprised. Although I knew it was coming and I was prepared, once I got there and I met them, it was very refreshing to see something absolutely different from what you're expecting of the nightlife or drinking or looking at old colonial buildings. And they received us with open arms. They had a line of Cuban women, and each Cuban woman took one of us by the hand and gave us a poster. The poster and the other materials are some of their instructional, educational materials on sexuality. The poster depicts a whole young family, a heterosexual family, and the instructor is opening a condom for them and showing them. So this is, different. You walked in and you go, is that a fruit? No, it's a condom they're opening. And they had another material on examination of your breast and another one on HIV prevention, which is something that they're very progressive about. After Cienfuegos, we visited, we had short trips. One of them was to visit the city of Trinidad. And the city of Trinidad, it is part of the UNESCO patrimony since in 1986. Therefore, the reconstruction of the city has been almost impeccable. The colors and so forth continue the tradition of the colonial period. These are mostly one-story houses with cobblestone streets. So it was very quaint and very colorful, and it's obviously a stop for the tourists to see because it almost feels like it stopped in time. And in Trinidad, we met an artist who was very different. She was a feminist artist who dealt with domesticity and women, and she offered to us some of her creations. I purchased a small coffee maker. The coffee makers that Cubans use, which are the Italian coffee maker, the metal ones, you know what I mean? And the coffee makers all have different positions, but the one that I picked was this one because it said that I'm in charge. Who doesn't want that one, right? Of course, I bought one for my middle sister, but I gave it to my brother-in-law because he's the one that makes the coffee in the morning. So he says, so what does my coffee maker says? And I say, well, that your wife is always right. No. Just trying to help my sister. But it was interesting to meet a young woman that travels around the world who lives in Trinidad and who offers her work and her interpretation of her gender so candidly. So that was interesting. We also visited Playa Girón, or the Bay of Pigs, and that was also a very interesting trip for me because I've written papers in college about the invasion of the ex-Cuban patriots returning to Cuba. So when I saw the mangrove forest and I saw the road that they took when they landed, I was very moved just because I had done that journey through books and through reading. And then I was there physically. It was similar to when I was in Venice and I saw San Mark Square. And I was like, I'm in Venice. Well, I'm in Cuba. So Bay of Pigs has a museum, and it's called the Girón, the museum. And it has a lot of the equipment, some of the uniforms from the battle. And it was very moving because our leader for our delegation, her husband, was one of those that was captured and spent 2 years in jail in Cuba. So I didn't know any of this until we arrived there. It was perhaps for me the place that was more propaganda-oriented from the whole trip, that I felt, oh, okay, I'm in Cuba and they're giving me a message, a direct message. We also visited a plantation of sugarcane, an old plantation, and we were able to see some machinery and to see some of the surrounding areas. But most of it is gone now. So basically it was a place for people to sell their trades and weave their blankets and sell us dolls and so forth. And then we took on a trip through the main highway to Havana. And that started like the Twilight Zone trip for me, because the highway is a 4-lane regular highway, and we were in a very nice air conditioning bus, and there's no cars. And I time it for 10 minutes, there's no cars. And then I start seeing people in bicycles on the right lane, in the middle of the highway. Imagine I-4 with no traffic and people on bikes and people walking the highway, and you know that there's no exit nearby, so they're just walking. So that was a very surreal kind of experience. And then I started thinking about one thing that troubled me through the whole trip, which was how do people get from one town to another, and how does food get to people's houses? If there's no trucks, if there's no delivery, how does the plantains and the tomatoes and how does the mangoes make it from town to town? So I started worrying a little bit about that. I remembering some stories about people not having enough of different things to eat. Because I am a feminist, one of the things that concerns me the most is the condition of women, and the condition of women working or not working outside of their home. But before we get started, I wanted to discuss with you the dual economy of Cuba, because it's important for us to try to understand that they have two currencies going on. Imagine if you had $1 in your pocket and a quarter, and you're paid by quarters, but if you work in the tourist industry, they will pay you with $1. So where would you want to be? I think you'll be with $1, not with the quarter. So the cooks are the currency, the convertible Cuban peso, CUC, the cook, that is mainly used for items of luxury for the tourism industry, not for the regular Cuban. The regular Cuban goes into a store with the peso. But you can see that one cook equals 25 pesos. So there's a big difference, correct? A government job averaged 15 cooks a month. So that's not a lot. Women's place in Cuba's workforce is about 41%, and 66 of all professionals are women. One of the best news that I received was how well educated everybody was in Cuba. Everybody was able to study. Everybody was able to study what they wanted. So some of the preconceived notions I had were wrong after I met some of the people there. I have a quote here for you. We all have education and careers, but many of us follow our dreams because we can't live on it. So this is a 32-year-old woman who was an educated special ed teacher and a former principal who had to leave her job in order to work in a cadeca. Cadecas are exchange houses run by the government because she wasn't making enough money as a special ed teacher. So although she was educated, she was not able to work in her field. Another thing that interests me, and I'm still a little confused, is on the housing situation in Cuba. We receive so many different messages. And of course, being Cuban and having left property, I know that the second you leave, and if there's no other relative, your property's gone. In my case, our property stayed in the family for many, many years. It's still in the family by a third cousin, a fourth cousin. So when you leave the island and nobody else in your family is going to leave that house goes into the government. But if you're in the island and everybody lives by you and you stay in that house is yours. Whoever is a relative of the owner and stays there the longest is the owner of that house. So for example, people that I visited, they were living in the grandfather's house. The grandfather is dead, but the mother is there with two of her daughters. Each family only has one home. Let's say before 1959, you had 5 houses. After the revolution, you have one house. So you decide which is your house and where are you going to stay. The housing is important because you cannot move from one town to another without asking official permission. And that official permission will be tied to where are you going to be living. So you would have to go into somebody that you know or that you are a relative of. Everything is much easier the Cuban way if you are related by blood somehow through this long line of people. One thing that I noticed when I was driving through Havana Central are the signs made with cardboard of se vende or casa for sale or house for sale, which is unusual, and it's now starting to appear because this was illegal before, but now they are starting to allow it. Not just an exchange, an equal exchange, but actually selling your property. So that's encouraging. Another thing that I did not know that surprised me was the amount of illegal migration that Havana has from other towns within Cuba of people that want to go to the capital and live there because obviously they're getting paid, they're getting cooks, they're getting tourism income, so it's a little bit more attractive and they have more resources, different food and so forth. So I did not know that they were dealing with that kind of situation with the illegal migration. And of course, if you're there illegally, you have to sublet, and that's illegal as well. So you are under the radar. You're trying to make money under the radar to either send it back to your town or trying to make enough money to look for a relative or find a way to stay in Havana. So people always make jokes. Where are you from? I'm from Havana. Well, the first or the second floor, because everybody comes from Havana. Women's complex situation. The first thing that we should discuss is the low birth rate. It's 1.4 per woman. And this has major implications. The population is aging, and in about 70 years, there will be a big gap between certain generations in Cuba. And of course, that affects the employment, and it affects the careers and the skills that the population have that can be support of and resources to each other. Employment plus low salaries. You find unemployment is not very high. You find employment, but your employment is attached to a low salary. So if you are getting paid very little, as a woman, you have to decide, where am I going with this? Can I support myself? who is going to help me? Who is going to be with me? Should I have children? Should I have more children? The housing issue. If you have a house that has one room and you decided to have a family, then you're going to be all in one room. So all those determine certain decisions in your future. They explain to us what they call the mono-serial monogamy. And again, as a scholar and researcher, I've often read on Cubans' divorce rate. So I was surprised about this because when you read divorce rates, they seem very high, but they're high because there's few marriages. There's few legal marriages, so the numbers of divorce seem very high. In reality, a woman would have 2 or 3 partnerships, a monogamous partnership, but not legal, in her lifetime. So perhaps in the first one she would have children and not in the second one or in the third. So there's 3 times that she will be living with a partner, but never married anyone. Family planning since 1964 and legal abortion since 1964 is also part of the complex situation for women. I have a quote here for you. This is another moment for me that was incredibly aha. Like I said before, as a scholar, I have read other Cuban scholars, and I'm a Spanish speaker. So I have read Isabel Moya before, but I didn't know who Isabel Moya until I saw her in front of me talking to me in Cuba. So I'm very worried about taping her because I want to get all her words when I realized that Isabel Moya was that researcher that I have read so often. Aha. So that's why I look like so excited in the picture. I'm almost like on top of her. Because I have agreed with her for so many years about her perception of family and her perception on gender. And this quote that she said that day I thought was very moving. She's the publisher of 2 magazines, Mujer and Muchacha, Women and Young Woman. She said, I think people should be supported and allowed to live in the groups they feel better and not living with people they struggle and fight with. Because life is too short. Let's be happy and respect each other. Society is strong when people have the right to live with whom they want to. The definition of marriage was also very surprising. I knew the definition of marriage in 1975, which reads, the legal union between a man and a woman. But today, the Federation of Women is trying to change the definition to a stable union between 2 humans. So if we look at it, we have taken away that binary code of men and women. We have taken away the legal ramification, and we have introduced an adjective, stable. Before, you didn't care if you were stable as long as you were legal, right? So you can see that the conversation that they're doing on gender is quite progressive. In reproductive rights in Cuba, by 2007, 77% of Cuban women used some method of birth control. By 2007, 20.4 was the abortion rate per 1,000 women. By 2007, sterilization among women was 24.4 and 0.3% among men. When we were discussing that, a lot of people started laughing because there's a big difference between the 2 groups, how they see sterilization. By 2007, women accounted the 19% of infected HIV and AIDS population. So this is a concern that is very real to them. Another very interesting aspect that I want to bring forward is the fact that women control paternity. After a woman gives birth, she completes the birth certificate and writes the name of the child and of the father. If a man disagrees with the paternity claim, the burden is on him to test and prove otherwise. So there's no second guessing who is the father and what is the name that you want for that child. I thought that was quite refreshing, to say the least. Therefore, among all this complex situation, we have a little bit of a masculinity crisis. And as it was discussed to us by Isabel Moya and Professor Rey, men continue to wait for the woman that does not exist anymore. And women want men to understand gender advances. Women feel that you should know that things are no longer the same. It's no longer 1962 or 1975. And men believe in the breadwinner myth. One of the studies that they quoted for us was the myth of the man breadwinner. This study was done in the University of Florida by Helen Safa. And Helen Safa talked about couples from Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and Cuba. The research found that the majority of unions have women as the breadwinner, but still, men perceive it to be the opposites. The men also believe that men have more education than women. Both perceptions are real to the Cuban man. So a perception lies here, and the reality is over here. So there's no matching. So that is very complex, especially for Cubans, excuse me, because Cubans are quite social. Romance and love is well and alive in Cuba. I did 4 different interviews with 4 different women. The first one was the president of the Federation of Cuban Women in Cienfuegos, Mayra Hernandez, and I asked her, she has 2 daughters. She has a grown-up daughter and a 12-year-old daughter. And I said, would your daughters follow your steps as a feminist? And she says that she thinks so because they're part of the environment that she's living in. Particularly Camila, who is 12 years old, because when she was 45 days after giving birth to Camila, Vilma Espin, the founder of the Federation, asked her to direct the 7th Assembly of the Federation, which is a great honor. So she came out of maternity, which is, by the way, 60 days in Cuba, paid, no matter what profession, paid, and no matter how many children you have. She was only 45 days after the delivery, but she says, yes, of course I will. So she presided the assembly, and at one point the baby got really fussy. So Vilma asked her, you can give her, you can breastfeed her right in here. So she did. And afterwards, Vilma was holding the baby, and she has pictures with her. Why is this important to this woman? It's important because Vilma Espin was the character of the Cuban revolutionary woman. She enforced the new attitude of the Cuban woman, the woman that could do everything, that could fall in love, have children, and also belong into the change of command, in charge of change as well. So in order to work with her and be with her, it was a great honor for Mayra Hernandez. In 1975, the family code did 3 things that were very important for the Cuban community and the Cuban family. The first thing is that consensual unions became legal. This is an age-old form of partnership in Cuba. After consensual couples became a legal union, there was no stigma surrounding concubines or the other woman. And there were no more negative connotations about having children born out of wedlock or out of a marriage. By 2007, 69% of children are born to a mother in a consensual union. By 1980, 11% of marriages come from a consensual union. And by 2007, it rose to 30%. So what those numbers are telling us is that 30% of all the marriages in 2007 started as a consensual union. 2 partners living together without legal bound eventually become legally married. Another thing that Family Code did was to allow joint ownership. And that's important because in case of a divorce, a woman is not left out in the street without property or money. Because whatever that couple made or had has to be divided. Now, for us, that makes sense, right? Because we're used to that. But imagine in a country that doesn't guarantee that. Who then is hurt the most? Particularly a woman that has not worked outside of the home, but only in the house taking care of children or elderly, who doesn't have a retirement, who then faces a new beginning, but a really rough new beginning. And the third is reproduction. Because reproduction, according to the Family Code, is an activity in which men and women share the same rights and responsibilities. So coming from a patriarchal lens, where men dictated most of the norms, rulings, and laws, to this kind of mentality where you also have to take care of your production. It's not just my problem, it's our problem, and it's at the same degree. Work resources. Cuba has an educated population working on non-related fields, looking for better salaries and opportunities. Some of the things that I was able to witness was flexible time. The women in El Quitrin, which is the sewing co-op, they can work from home and bring in the materials to help finish the blouses and the dresses in the workshop, and they're not penalized by that. Most people work 5.5 days a week. They have extra incentives and pay, but those extra incentives could be taken away immediately if something is not right. So my friend that works in the money exchange in the Cadeca, she receives 10 cooks a month extra. But if she's late, if she calls in that she can not come in, if she's sick and can't come in, they take away those $10. So they dangle a little bit in front, and she tries very much. Why do I know this? Because her mother is ill, and she has to take her a lot to the hospital and to certain appointments, and those she has to miss work. And that's difficult for her. There's a constant fear to lose your job because there's somebody else waiting to get it. So you lose your job and you might not get it, but there's somebody behind you. I will get it. I need it. So there's a little bit of a fear of, if I lose this job, I'm not going to be able to get it again. Somebody's going to be in my place. Private and small businesses are being introduced into Cuba, and we saw this in 3 ways. We saw this in small restaurants coming out of people's homes. We saw that in beauty parlors, and we saw that in rooms for rent. The person I visited has a room for rent. So she keeps saying, why are you in Hotel Nacional paying 130 cooks a day when you could be here with me and I'll be cooking for you and giving you coffee in bed for 15 cooks a night? And I tried to explain that I was part of a group with a package. I couldn't just disappear into Cuba. Well, I could, but that would be a little complicated. The government has allowed this small entrepreneurs, small industries to start trickling into the economy, but they have now to pay taxes, which Cubans do not pay. Only those that have private industry are paying for taxes. So there's a little bit of a token. Wellness. So how do women compare from 1959 to 2012? These are some of my observations. Women suffer from stress and depression, and I think that's shared around the world, not just Cuba. Women are usually the caregivers of children and aging parents, mostly in relationships, but there are fewer heads of households by themselves. Let me explain this. Most households are intergenerational, so you would have more than one generation living in a home. So there's less women that are head of households when they're alone with a partner, because there's less situations like that. Because even if you're young and you have a partner, you're probably living with some cousin, your aunt or your mother, or his or her brother. So it's within the generation. There's higher satisfaction with sexuality. I think women have more of an open discussion about their sexuality, and nobody laughs. And men are more giving into that discussion as before. There's lower adolescent pregnancy rates. So reproductive rights in that sense have really conquered a big problem. Because as you know, when a woman becomes a mother at early age, it's very likely that that cycle of poverty will continue all her life, including to that child. So by avoiding this in Cuba, they're preparing for the next generation to be able to go to school and do other things. They have less children, so they spend less time being a mother. And the funny thing that I ask about the grandparents is that the grandparents are busy being themselves, not grandparents. So it's, again, a little similar to our situation in this country where grandparents have hobbies, travel, other things to do, not necessarily being the caregivers of the grandchildren. Their numbers are moderate for HIV and AIDS. It's a less homophobic society and less homophobic laws. And it's a less sexist society with less sexist laws. Now let me stop here for a moment. Because Cuba, I believe, is between two worlds. It's coming from a patriarchal society and going in through a different lens, a lens of more gender equality, but not quite there. They're almost like walking through a tunnel, but not arriving to the other end. There are many laws in the books, but not necessarily that means that it's part of their heart or their mentality. So that we have to understand that the intrinsicies of relationships within a couple continue to be primarily sexist. So we have to be careful with the discussion because a tradition of only about 53 years is very, very fresh for them to make very big changes. Now, of course, your generation, the younger generation, see things very differently, but the system continues and the perception continues. So it's going to be a while that continues through that tunnel. But I think they're in a very good position. For my conclusion, I wanted to bring you some things that I noticed and some things that I have research on. The situation is complex between a former patriarchal society and a newer gender equal state. There's a real life negotiation between work and family. We have an increasing second shift burden. A second shift is the shift that women do when they come from work and they go home and they have to continue doing the chores and taking care of the children and being the driver and going to consultations with the teacher and going to bed at 11 p.m., finishing laundry. That second shift is an increasing burden for the Cuban women who has no choice and needs to work outside of the home. Many possibilities for change among all citizens, including transgender people. It was refreshing to listen to them saying that they're trying to work with the government through the Federation to allow transgender people to change their gender in their ID, even though some of them cannot be able to change it by having surgery. But allowing them then to actually decide on that personal pronoun and that gender within their identity ID, which everybody has to carry in Cuba. That has not been approved, but it is still under consideration. There's more sensitivity towards gender roles. There's not so much as expected, that's the way it has to happen, but there's more negotiation. So I think it's very good news. And there's a vibrant change culture with some state limitations. What I mean is that the spirit of the Cuban has been very resourceful, has been able to create and do things with hardly anything. So they will find a way, I'm sure about it. But I know that the state is everywhere. We were not feeling paranoid or anything like that. Nobody was following us. But we had 3 different visits from 3 different government officials during our trip, talking to our leader and making sure that everything was okay. But I never felt, I forgot that I was in Cuba. I never felt that I had like, ooh, I'm in a communist country. Oh, somebody's watching me. I cannot talk to anybody. The people are friendly. They're warm. They love the United States. When we ask in the El Pino, which is the farming co-op, what do they need? What would you want us to tell other people? They said, we don't need anything, but we want you to know that we like the people from the United States. That was the message that the farmers gave us, that they were very, very friendly to us. Everybody that we spoke to, and obviously I speak Spanish, so I always got that free drink and all those different conversations. They were very, very pleased that I was even back, which always was a little bit of my fear, that people will say, why are you here? You left. Why are you back here? But every time I said I'm from Santiago de Cuba, oh, Santiaguera, and they will come in and talk. Especially at the sewing workshop, I was able to talk to some of the women. And there was one woman from Santiago. So we were talking, and she started telling me all these names of all these places. And I said, I haven't been here in 47 years. You know your city more than I do. So the trip was something of a lifetime. It has really changed my life. I will apply for a Cuban passport and travel next year with my Cuban passport. I have my original Cuban passport when I left. I left legally. And I am bringing my sisters and my mother who have never seen the island again. So I think it's going to be very moving. I think it's important for us to continue talking people to people and experiencing their lives and their cultures and their ways. They seem to know much more about us than we know about them. We had so many preconceived notions, and our leader said, you're going to have questions, but you're going to come back with more. And that was so true, because although, like I said, I read, I'm a geek, I'm a scholar, I had so many questions and so many answers and so many new questions after my trip that I hope that someday I'll be able to answer.